So, okay, again, I'm Dani Stockman from the Political Science Department at Leiden University, and I study Chinese politics. And as you were talking about the link between religion and transcendent thought and modernity, I was wondering whether you could talk about under which circumstances modernity and religion go together, and under which circumstances they don't, because so as I was thinking about this example that you mentioned about the link between Taoism and environmental protection, I also had to think about Chinese policy towards Tibet and how modernization is there used as a substitute sometimes for religion. So I was wondering under which circumstances you thought the two of them went together and under which circumstances they don't.
Do you want me to answer or collect some questions, or up to you?
Whatever has your preference. Would you like to take some more questions and then answer?
No, I can try and do this. There isn't a good answer to that because, of course, one of my arguments in my larger thesis is what we call religion is in itself a big problem, but only because it is a translation, as it were, into circumstances where the idea of faith and belief and so on which is so central to Western concepts of religion, is not necessarily that central, right? And you have different kinds of division, and so it makes it very difficult to transfer. So in other words, modernity and religion, some aspects of modernity go very well with commercial religions, right? The kinds of what Charles Taylor calls ordinary religions of human flourishing, where you pray for something and you get the next Gucci bag, or you get the next lottery and so on. Those go very well with consumerism and so on, and that aspect of modernity. And certainly that flourishes very much. But there are other dimensions and which produce a sense of commitment, right? And that's the transcendent dimension that I'm talking about. And that, I think, has had a bad rap with modernity. There isn't a proper space for it philosophically. And as a result, we are suffering for it.
I'll talk loud. Yeah. Anthropology, Patricia Spire. I thought it was a really compelling talk. So thank you very much for opening our Asian modernities and traditions for this very provocative and also extremely ambitious, programmatic, in a way, lecture. I guess one of the things that I wondered about, I agree very much that we are in need of new models or forms of transcendence, right? One of the things you emphasize about the cultivation of the self, and you speak a lot less of collectivities as a part of that. And what comes in place of collectivity, perhaps, is a certain notion of cosmopolitanism, which I'm also very sympathetic to, but politically I'm not quite sure how that will work out. And one of the things which I think the nation state has provided in many ways, in very complicated ways, for better or for worse, is recognition. Also tons of exclusion, but how does that work, or how do you see that coming together with forms of commitment? I'm not being completely clear, but
No, I understand. It's an important question.
All right.
Let me then convert it to my understanding and then answer that. No, actually, I don't have a good answer. But I underemphasize the collective dimension, only accidentally. Because I think it's very important to grasp how traditional forms, and traditional forms actually worked on the self in some very important ways that we don't recognize because we think of individualism as this form of the self, right? But actually historic forms work very much at the individual level. But then also this is a way that you cannot be yourself without being part of a community, right? And that's the connection, and that I think ignored, and we have to look at much more closely. But of course, I mean, that it should be. And here I think I have a sort of my knee-jerk fallback position is a kind of communitarianism, but it's communitarianism 2.0. So if your local community is where yourself and the ecology of your local community is the functional entity, right? But nonetheless, so it is a kind of community that you're working with to revive, to recover, to restore, is your heritage. And I think the notion of heritage is becoming transformed and is becoming a very important concept of our times, much more than just heritage of certain cultural traditions and so on. It includes the environment. It's a sort of a stakes of what's at stake in this environment. Is it our heritage? But of course, what I want to do, the reason it's 2.0 is that I also see that it links to the universal, or to the larger than the local. And this has to do, the way I see that functioning is through transnational NGOs and other forms of transnational civil societies. And here there are lots of interesting things. I mean, I gave that small example about the Taoists and so on. But there are all kinds of ways in which transnational NGOs are working with. One of the most interesting things that we don't know about very well is the Three Gorges Dam in China. And before that, the Sarovar Dam in Gujarat, which had massive anti-dam movements and was recognized by both. There were all kinds of groups in China arguing for how it would be an ecological disaster, which I think it has turned out to be now. I think there's some certain circles are saying that the Three Gorges Dam will have to be abandoned. We never know. But what happened was that when this knowledge began to come out in China in the 90s and early 2000s, the international NGOs mobilized very successfully. But they couldn't mobilize within China. They mobilized globally. So they mobilized first within their own nation states, America, many European countries, UK, to make sure that the Three Gorges was not funded. Secondly, they mobilized with the World Bank and so on, so they didn't get that funding. Thirdly, they mobilized even with Morgan Stanley through their shareholders. And so China got no extra, beyond a certain year, no more international funding. It became very expensive for China then to look within, right? So, but it gives you a sense of how much these movements are linking and have this potential link in order to go from the individual to the local collective to the transnational as a kind of methodology. So you notice that I'm leaving out the nation from all this because it is already pre-mobilized and it'll be there in some form or the other. But that's how I see this. And I also see this as, in my segment on Tagore, I talk about how he uses the natural, the environment to get in, but then uses it as a much wider collective mobilization project.
All right, thank you. The microphone's going to have to travel again. We have a question over there. Take a few more minutes.
Do we have power? Hi, I'm Chris Gotto-Jones from Humanities in Leiden. I loved your expression, transcendence, epistemic locus. I'm trying to work out what this means. And I think you're making an attempt to recover metaphysics as part of a way of political thinking, which I appreciate, and sort of avoiding, or at least trying to sideline, religion, which would be the sort of slippery slope, right? And so then in your answer earlier about this epistemic locus and that transcendence as a sort of process of getting there, I guess, being about producing forms of commitment. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if this sort of expression brings us back to the question of religion, and in particular, and something you haven't really talked about, the question of conversion. And you will be well aware of the literature in sort of pre-war Japanese literature about tenko and sort of secular conversion and apostasy and things. I wondered if you had anything to say.
Well, I guess you cannot get away. You're right in trying to say that I'm trying to sort of take a very dodgy stance between transcendence and not get into religions and so on, use religions as a model and so on, and it is a difficult path. And I think the conversion thing is a very actually critical issue, because converts are sometimes the most passionate and irrational, right? And this is can be a problem. And actually you see this in environmental movements. When people become converts to environmental movements, they become very radical, right? So, and it is that same sense of commitment. I have this commitment, I have the truth, I have this, It's very much like that. But I think it helps still that it is not ultimately a religion, which then ritualize. No, ritual is important, but which then we can't get away from terms of modernization, right? Which ossifies sacred authority, right? I think that's the problem. That's what I'm trying to get away from. You need a certain sacrality for power, and you need the figures of hope. Right?
All right.
What Ricoeur calls figures of hope. Okay.
Sorry about that. We have 2 final questions. Can you please be brief?
Thank you. Yes, I'll try to be brief. Florian Schneider from the Chinese department. I read your sentence up here saying we need to mobilize self-cultivation practices, and probably in order to achieve this kind of commitment. And I'm wondering how using what Foucault called regimes of truth and infusing them with our truths sits at odds with the kind of critical scholarship that's supposed to dismantle regimes of truth. So I'm kind of wondering, is both possible at the same time? Can we utilize regimes of truth and at the same time be critical of them?
I think it's the same problem of sacrality and reason, that the one can't do without the other. And we have to find new forms of equilibrium, new forms of non-ossification. But we cannot get passionate about something purely on the basis of reason. So I don't have answers. Lina, I think, had a question.
The final question in the back there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Quick question. I just read a novel by a Chinese professor in literature, and I think he also wrote a lot on philosophy, and he's, I think, what you can call a transcendence prophet. I mean, the whole novel. Really? Yeah, his name is Ge Hongping.
Ge Hongping.
Sorry, first time.
Yeah.
Ge Hongping.
Like
red.
Must have been born in 1966.
69.
Red Guard.
Yeah. Almost. 69. Yeah, and I was just wondering, because, he's really influenced by Kant and also by the French author Thoreau. But I was just wondering, because could you speak of like a transcendentalist movement in China, or is it really, because he's really like promoting it throughout the novel, and so is this a...
Actually, I can't, and maybe I should look into that. But I am looking at one in India right now, which is very interesting. I mean, and I'm sure Indians will attack me, because all Indian intellectuals have been attacking this fellow called Anna Hazare, who recently led this movement. But I think these intellectuals just don't get it. I mean, they're trying to see him in their own terms of what is right and wrong. And, I'm sure I'll have nothing to do with the guy. I mean, he's completely different from the kind of person, things I believe in. But he's, for those of you who are not familiar, there was in the middle of August, although it started earlier in April and so on, a massive anti-corruption movement in India led by this Gandhian called Anna Hazare, and he led a fast. And the Indian intellectuals and the Indian government felt that this was blackmailing the constitutional system. It was anti-constitutional. But I think he actually did a very careful civil disobedience movement where, you have to, the constitution doesn't work, you have to push against it. but you cannot let it get violent. And he stopped at that, with the threat of violence, but with that, right? The amazing thing is that the guy is no Gandhian from origins. He's not an intellectual. He was a truck driver for the army. He had a near-death experience. He was in the war against Pakistan in 65, 65, right? And he was grazed and he was left for dead, and he got up and he decided he would become a Gandhian. And he did all these projects in the villages, like a Liang Shuming kind of thing, but from his own very local sort of perspective, which some of it was quasi-fascist. I mean, not violent, but you tie up an offender to a tree and, have him shamed in front of the community and so on. So, I mean, but then he uses the entire symbology of Gandhism, right? And so it's precisely the kind of imagery, the symbology that works with a certain rationality of civil disobedience, and that got millions of people excited. I mean, these things don't happen out of the blue, Democracy came too early to India, before you had a middle class that could secure it. Now the middle class has sort of reached the position, and they have property interests and other interests and so on. They want accountability. So that's the socio-political condition. But the movement itself is very much appeals to certain forms of transcendence. Be interesting to look for something like that in China soon. And I think it'll happen.
In other respects, it's a very disturbing novel, so I have to warn you. But
Right, well, thank you very much again, and thank you for your questions and your comments. We'll conclude this session at this point and reconvene here in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.